In America, progressives and Marxists use the electoral process, specifically the Democrat Party in the United States, as a means of advancing their agenda of making marginal adjustments to the status quo of government domination in favor of their marginal preferences. Similarly, an anarchist philosopher should have a strategy for achieving their desired political, or in this case anti-political, goals. Otherwise, their ideas are just words. As such, Hoppe has embraced the strategy of secessionism. Secessionism is supporting political movements for political bodies to separate from and no longer be under the political jurisdiction of another political body they were previously subject to, typically because the smaller government is better able to meet the interests of its ruling class better than the government it's seceding from. The secessionist sees the act of secession itself as a positive, and will generally support them irregardless of the movement's actual motivations or principles. For Hoppe, the status quo of nation-state borders is a homeostasis of the various ruling classes in power expanding their jurisdictions as far as they do not conflict with other political powers that could militarily threaten them. The side effect has been the absorption and assimilation of multiple different demographics, with mutually exclusive and even outright conflicting cultural norms put in proximity under a system of common legislation and common borders by the rulers. While legislative fiat increases the likelihood that hostile groups come into contact. For example, the welfare state in Europe and the US being a financial incentive for third world immigrants to settle into the West, exacerbated by open borders policies, such as the non-enforcement of current immigration legislation. Forced integration, illustrated by such measures as busing, rent controls, anti-discrimination laws, and free immigration, invariably creates tension, hatred, and conflict. In contrast, voluntary separation leads to social harmony and peace. Were people free to set rent, discriminate from their property, or choose who they do or do not allow into their societies, people would voluntarily separate. And you can see this for yourself. Go to a government school cafeteria during lunch, and you can see that the nerds sit with the nerds, the Latinos sit with the Latinos, the basketball Americans sit with each other. You get the idea. Nobody forced them to do this, and far from a horrific melee, it's quite peaceful. For the most part anyways. Limiting contact to mutually beneficial arrangements. In the absence of government-imposed forced integration, these arrangements do not happen. Thus, Hoppe argues that secession enables larger varieties of demographics to peacefully coexist within their own separated societies. Politically fragmented nation-states would, to Hoppe, be more harmonious. In addition, smaller, more numeric political bodies would lower the cost of emigration for their citizens, encouraging people to simply leave if they find the economic restrictions and appropriations of a political body to be too burdensome. Thus, it is argued, these political bodies have an incentive to significantly restrict the victimization of other people's property. More importantly, secession always involves increased opportunities for interregional migration, and a secessionist government is immediately confronted with the specter of emigration. To avoid the loss of its most productive subjects, it is under increased pressure to adopt comparatively liberal domestic policies by allowing more private property and imposing a lower tax and regulation burden than its neighbors. The basic idea is a nation ought to fragment into multiple, smaller nations across ethnic, regional, cultural, religious, sectarian, insert reason here lines. If the world doesn't blow up, then secession can be brought down to the town, to the household, and eventually the individual. Each time, fragmented powers are competing with each other for people's productivity and tax-paying power. As if they don't like being oppressed in one country, they can just move. This fragmentation also encourages international and interregional trade, as geographically smaller countries have less an ability to be self-sufficient. According to Hoppe, geographically smaller states are always less oppressive than ones in larger governments. Towards this end, anarchism is the logical conclusion of a world moving away from globalist alliances and economic hegemonies and into tiny regional governments and free cities. Governments competing for tax money, lowering the direct cost on their citizens until there's nothing left. As such, the praxis of Hoppe is the support of and creation of secessionist movements in nation-states across the world. So, what's the problem?
So, secessionism is itself a bit of a contentious topic within libertarian circles, specifically how secession is conceived of and the praxis with which secession is practiced, and whether or not secession is even compatible with the libertarian set of principles or praxis in the first place. One of the few issues here where the blame for the conceptual disconnect and the problem with defining our terms is not entirely Hoppe's fault. The issue here comes with the concept of secession existing within an inherently pro-political praxis, as in a sovereign, politically recognized entity legally parting from a different political body. The reason why secession by pretty much everyone else, including most of the libertarians who think of themselves as secessionists, conceptualize secession in this way, is because from the secessionist perspective, they're seeking to merely leave the state's jurisdiction and not actually do anything about the state's ability to continue imposing violence upon anyone else, or even them. Nor do they care about or even really take into consideration the state or an entity like the state influencing the rest of society around them through legislative, coercive means, to where even if they were to somehow get the state to go along with the secessionist libertarians, setting up a smaller government, quote-unquote, or some sort of private society where the state had no jurisdiction, the state would still be able to force them to operate in its interests by manipulating the market signals of firms which exist within the new libertarian territory's legal economy. Secessionist libertarians see becoming politically independent from the state, that is, the state recognizing that they or their organization of secessionist libertarians through legislative means is not subject to the state's dominion as a means of achieving libertarian ends. And there are quite a few libertarians who would probably try and argue that secessionism doesn't inherently exist within a political praxis. However, just like secessionism broadly as a means of abolishing the state, I've never heard a good explanation for why this is, and it doesn't appear to be possible to provide one since the entire concept seems to rely inescapably upon the assumption that their secession would be recognized through legislative fiat, and therefore is dependent upon the assumption that the state will just leave them alone and let them have property. In other words, it's literally the state-enforced anarchy meme, except these people are being dead serious. Now, if I were to go over all of my criticisms of libertarian secession specifically, this section would probably be longer than all of the others combined. Plus, I've already gone over the main issues with libertarianism being argued within a political praxis in my video criticizing minarchism, and since it's not really integral to the subject of this essay, just know that ends are a reflection of the means used to achieve them. Since this is the case, you can't really argue for libertarian conclusions around the assumption that you'll reach those conclusions with means that rely on state coercion or legislation. So, as a disclaimer, in general, I find myself at odds with the notion that secession can be a libertarian strategy. This being said, Hoppe's perspective, even as far as libertarian secessionism goes, is complete incomprehensible nonsense, and frankly, I'm shocked more people haven't criticized him here.
Political integration, centralization, and economic market integration are two completely different phenomena. Political integration involves the territorial expansion of a state's power of taxation and property regulation, expropriation. Economic integration is the extension of the interpersonal and interregional division of labor and market participation. In principle, taxing and regulating private economy owners and market income earners, all governments are counterproductive. They reduce market participation and the formation of economic wealth. Once the existence of a government has been assumed, however, no direct relationship between territorial size and economic integration exists. Switzerland and Albania are both small countries, but Switzerland exhibits a high degree of economic integration, whereas Albania does not. Both the US and the former Soviet Union are large. Yet while there is much division of labor and market participation in the US, there was almost no economic integration in the Soviet Union, where virtually no private capital ownership existed. Centralization, then, can go hand in hand with either economic progress or retrogression. Progress results whenever a less taxing and regulating government expands its territory at the expense of a more exploitative one. If the reverse occurs, centralization implies economic disintegration and retrogression. Political competition, then, is far more effective device for limiting a government's natural desire to expand its exploitative powers than are internal constitutional limitations.
Hoppe goes on to explain his position in greater detail in the fifth essay of Democracy the God That Failed, entitled On Centralization and Secession. Basically, his characterization of a libertarian secession is that a superstate which privatizes everything, whatever that means, will take over other states and force them to privatize their state property, because it's in the nature of governments to attempt and tax as much income from people living in their territory as possible. Competition will eventually come into the picture as states attempt to exert their influence over a greater amount of resources, and competition can't exist in an environment of competing states because states are fundamentally coercive organizations. Therefore, it's in the interest of governments to create secessionist movements to compete with each other and attract taxpayers, and increasingly privatize as much state property as possible in order to create as many resources as possible. I am not making this up. We'll be posting links to all the cited material in the pinned comment, so if you want to go and check Democracy the God That Failed for yourself, go ahead. I am in no way mischaracterizing what he said.
Hoppe's argument that smaller political bodies are less oppressive is not accurate. See North Korea for a modern example. Even ignoring that totalitarian hellhole, more numerous political bodies means more potential geopolitical rivals that require greater degrees of plundering of the domestic population to fund militaries states need to defend against each other. The threat of possible imminent attack from neighbors raises the price of protection, which means greater tax and regulatory burdens on their captive population. Now, let's take a look at the economics of secession, specifically the incentives of the political body the secessionists seek separation from. During the feudal era, favors, allegiances, honor, and station what was most important to the well-being of economic actors. Following the Protestant Reformation and the mainstreaming of the Gunpowder Revolution, new technology, such as what the aforementioned gunpowder was useful for, made having large armies more profitable than ever. Armies could now more effectively dominate larger battlefields and control greater territory. However, large armies are expensive and need to be funded somehow. Taxes seem like the obvious choice, but as you might imagine, sustenance farmers don't have much in the way of production to tax. That's where the technology I mentioned earlier comes in. With the printing press, the cost of copying books plummeted, allowing more people greater access to literature, which leads to skyrocketing literacy rates, which led to people being more productive, as knowledge was now more easily preserved and more communicable. As more people learned more high-skilled jobs, this led to greater productivity. Greater productivity means more resources to tax, which allows governments to fund giant armies. You see how this is going? Governments now had an incentive to maximize productivity in their land so that they may have the largest armies, not only to keep their taxed livestock alive, but to potentially dominate others in the future and gain their taxed livestock. Now, the simplest way to increase productivity is, of course, to have the most territory that can be developed, in addition to having the largest population. More people who are productive means more taxes, which means bigger armies. As such, the incentive of a government is to make sure as many people remain captive within their territory as possible. How would a state react if 1/4 of their captive tax cattle go, "Nah, I don't want to associate with this political body anymore"? This isn't an academic question. We saw what they would do, such as during the War of Northern Aggression, known colloquially as the American Civil War, initiated by the United States because the Confederate States did not pay the tariff revenue Washington, D.C. claimed they owed them. We saw this more recently with the Catalonia region in Spain, where the Greater Spanish government claimed a referendum on whether or not people wanted Catalonian independence was illegal, barring separatists from entering polling places, confiscating ballot boxes, and arresting secessionist politicians and leaders. The state sees secessionism as a direct threat to their ability to assert power and will come down on secessionists hard. Why not? It's in their economic incentive to do so, as their tax cattle leaving means they have a harder time financing themselves. Now, one may look at this and think, hey, secession directly hurts the state's ability to assert force and collect resources. This is an effective strategy. I can see why one would come to that conclusion from what I just said, and strictly speaking, they're not wrong. Trouble is that the same incentive that drives states toward consolidation and conquest would also drive seceded political bodies to do the same. If there's one thing governments are very good at, it's waging war against other governments. In virtually all cases, the seceded power will be smaller and weaker than that which they left from, making them vulnerable to coercion, conquest, and re-annexation. The best you can hope for is a return to the status quo, and at worst, it sparks a massive, bloody war that sets back social and technological advancement a full generation, at the cost of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lives and broken families. As it is a direct threat to their wealth and power, governments are incentivized to take any measure to prevent freelance violence from proliferating, which is entirely what secessionism is. Freelancers in violence seeking their own geographical monopoly. The secessionist is not responsible at all for how violently their former rulers react, and Hoppe most certainly does not want people to die. The principle is sound. People have a right to freely associate, and that includes disassociation, especially from criminal enterprises like states, through creating additional criminal enterprises. Though if one is interested in a pragmatic shift away from states, it isn't the state that needs to be changed, or the creation of additional states, but the mega-political conditions that allows for centralization and violence to be as profitable as it is. New technology, such as the internet, microprocessing, CNC machines, and 3D printing, as well as cryptocurrency, are fundamentally altering how people associate and organize, especially as more economic assets, value, and production is centered in cyberspace, creating a jurisdiction problem when digital goods can be effectively teleported anywhere in the world to where it is cheapest to produce them. This alters the relationship between the state and citizens, making legislation and taxation significantly more difficult and costly, if not outright impossible, to enforce. This reduces the economic returns on initiating violence against peaceful people, creating economic pressure on the state to downscale significantly, and I mean very significantly, or collapse. Then, only then, would secessionism be a pragmatic solution to avoiding state control, as they would be powerless to stop secessionists. If you're participating in technological innovation and modes of commerce that subvert the state's rule, well, it's too late. You're not a secessionist. You're an agorist.
Hoppe creates a few issues with how he characterizes the interests of states, and how he argues that states act upon those interests, to put it mildly. Firstly, Hoppe assumes that the only consistent ways which states are able to expropriate resources is through the taxation of income. This is incredibly easy to disprove with a load of historical data and even a few modern examples. For instance, the highest tax rate on income or individually owned assets under the Roman Empire in the entire history of its existence was 3%. The highest for the Soviet Union was never more than 20%. In North Korea, Nazi Germany, along with several empires in feudal Europe throughout the Middle Ages, don't or didn't even have taxes on income. The reason for this is ironically due to something which Hoppe himself noted.
In principle, in taxing and regulating private economy owners and market income earners, all governments are counterproductive. They reduce market participation in the formation of economic wealth. Once the existence of a government has been assumed, however, no direct relationship between territorial size and economic integration exists.
Governments as organizations don't operate around market signals to obtain their funding, and therefore by nature are economically parasitic. They have a paradoxical relationship with their subjects' resources contrasted with their own interests. The more resources a government systemically appropriates, the less profitable it becomes for people who are subjugated by their state to associate within their legal market.
To Hoppe, since the democratic state has allowed everyone, on principle, to become rulers, the natural aristocracy has been effectively eradicated. If the state were to disappear tomorrow, there would be no arbitrators to resolve disputes, resulting in chaos. Hence, secessionism is meant not only to shrink territories and encourage governments to become less oppressive by making it easier for people to vote with their feet by emigrating to less oppressive jurisdictions, but it's also meant to buy time for the natural aristocracy to return. Trouble is, the return of the natural aristocracy and the emergence of the natural order is just assumed to be a given, with no causal explanation for how the creation of yet more states, which could also be democratic, will nurture the re-emergence of a natural order at all. Surely more states would be just as destructive to natural aristocracies. Furthermore, the creation of a large number of small governments encourages competition between governments. Government competition is reductive, meaning it takes competitors out of the market. Now what does that mean? Increased political centralization and an increased price demanded by governments for the cost of production. But don't take my word for it.
Assuming no more than self-interest on the part of government agents, all states or all governments must be expected to make use of this monopoly and thus exhibiting a tendency toward increased exploitation. On the one hand, this means increased domestic exploitation and internal taxation. On the other hand, and it is this aspect in particular that will be of interest, it means, of course, territorial expansionism. States will always want to enlarge their exploitation and tax base. In trying to do so, however, they will come into conflict with other competing states. The competition between states as territorial monopolists of compulsion is by its very nature an eliminative competition. That is, there can be only one monopolist of exploitation and taxation in any given area, and thus the competition between different states can be expected as promoting a tendency toward increased political centralization and ultimately one single world state. A glance at Western history suffices to illustrate the validity of this conclusion. At the beginning of this millennium, for instance, Europe consisted of thousands of independent political units. Now, only several dozen such units remain in existence.
This is completely contradictory with Hoppe's view that a large number of small governments will compete with each other economically and become less oppressive, encouraging more decentralization. On page 3 of his essay Nationalism and Secession, he says, "First, secession always involves the breaking away of a smaller from a larger population and is thus a vote against the principle of democracy and majoritarian ownership in favor of private decentralized property. More importantly, secession always involves increased opportunities for interregional migration, and a secessionist government is immediately confronted with the specter of emigration. To avoid the loss of its most productive subjects, it is under increased pressure to adopt comparatively liberal government policies by allowing more private property and imposing a lower tax and regulation burden than its neighbors. Ultimately, with as many territories as separate households, villages, or towns, the opportunities for economically motivated emigration would be maximized and government power over a domestic economy minimized. A Europe consisting of hundreds of distinct countries, regions, and cantons, of thousands of independent free cities, such as the present-day oddities of Monaco, San Marino, and Andorra, with the greatly increased opportunities for economically motivated migration that would result, would be one of small liberal governments economically integrated through free trade and an international commodity money such as gold, it would be a Europe of unparalleled economic growth and unprecedented prosperity. Suffice to say, secessionism, according to my understanding of Hoppe, means governments will infringe on people's rights more and less simultaneously. Thus, it is how we achieve anarchism. And this isn't my characterization. If you're having trouble squaring this circle, don't worry, you're not alone. I could reasonably guess that Hoppe is not deliberately trying to confuse people, so he has either some other information I have failed to identify that reconciles this contradiction, or he has failed to consider this. The simplest solution is that he's changed his mind over time, however I have seen no evidence for this. As such, I have to assume he has failed to recognize this contradiction in his own ideas. Though it's worth noting that Hoppe believes that free emigration would be a given. Problem is, governments can shut down borders, something Hoppe directly advocates for as part of his populist political platform. To be sure, under present all-pervasively politicized conditions and involvement in politics and party politics cannot be entirely avoided. Of course, the problem with using statist means to achieve anti-statist ends fails at the conceptual level, as discussed earlier, as your ends are inextricably linked to your means. This applies for secessionism too, as it's a directly political act, the founding of additional monopolies on arbitration. But even if we are willing to ignore that, cartels of states can, and do, illegalize freelance emigration through international agreements like the passport system. That smaller governments would not close their borders, have their borders closed off by their neighbors, or even institute an expat tax, where citizens still must pay income tax regardless of their physical location, is an entirely unknowable hypothesis. To say nothing of the regime of closed borders, directly advocated for under Hoppe's populist platform in getting libertarianism right. His own ideas are directly antagonistic to the belief that smaller secessionist governments and smaller, more numerous states would result in a freer world. Yet Hoppe makes the assumption that secessionist governments are always less oppressive, which simply is not the case in history. Revolutionary Catalonia, for instance, actually managed to be even more oppressive and totalitarian than under Franco's Spain, and one could argue North Korea is a secessionist government. Given that we all recognize states have an inherently parasitical relationship with non-state agents, one could only come to the conclusion that an additional state would somehow be exempt from this rule through wishful thinking. Hoppe actually is on the right track in the sense that people will be able to move more easily between more favorable legal jurisdictions. However, he presents this as a consequence of widespread political fragmentation rather than something facilitated by technology. As we have explained, the possibility of political fragmentation is virtually non-existent, and even if it were not, there is no guarantee that migration would be free. Thus, his observation is still wrong, and any accuracy it does have falls into the category of even a broken clock is right twice a day. Now, on principle, the ethics of secessionism are sound, for the most part. No individual or even political entity ought to be forced into associating with another, and may cut ties for any reason they wish. As a methodology for restoring the natural order, achieving anarchism, it relies on a series of assumptions about the interests and motivations regarding the secessionists that simply does not correspond to reality, such as Hoppe's evident doublethink in regards to competition between states being centralizing and decentralizing. It relies on Hoppe not recognizing the performative contradiction in using and legitimizing political rule to end political rule. I said at the beginning of this part how Marxists use the political process to achieve their ends too. The difference between them and alleged anarchists using politics is that political rule is not only compatible with Marxism, but favorable to it. They're canoeing downstream. Hoppians, meanwhile, are not only trying to canoe upstream, but trying to dry up the whole damn river by rowing through it. Who do you think is going to be more successful, dear viewer? Unlike a river, which is merely a passive reflection of the laws of physics exerting itself upon H2O, the state will actively facilitate the success of Marxism while inhibiting state-skeptic philosophies from gaining power. Honestly, it's very interesting how Hoppe recognizes the state as an active force in impairing property rights, but believes it to be passive on the issue of who gets political power and on the issue of secessionism, when there is plenty of evidence to the contrary, much of which Hoppe himself presents. It also relies on historical negationism about the actual driving force behind shifts in the political economy, namely the economics of violence, all to manipulate anarchists into political participation through conflating their self-interest with the state, making them believe there is a political means to achieving their anti-political ends. And as we learned from the section on argumentation ethics, to Hoppianism, a performative contradiction makes a proposition invalid. Speaking of historical negationism,